All right, you all, last chapter. Are you excited? We made it. So today we are on chapter 46, which is major ecosystems of the biosphere. Let's get to it and let's get going. So first of all, climate in the biosphere, then terrestrial ecosystems, and followed by aquatic ecosystems. So climate is the prevailing weather conditions in a region over a long period of time. So climate is looking at weather and weather over not just like a day or two, but just like over an extended period of time. Weather consists of environmental conditions that occur over short periods, and climate is over like a long period. So there's variations in solar radiation distribution due to the tilt of the Earth. So like the Earth is not straight up, the Earth is tilted. And so sometimes the Earth is going to hit here, and sometimes the Earth, or the sun is, sometimes the sun is going to hit here, and sometimes the sun is going to hit more here or over on this side. And so depending on where the sun is hitting, that's going to have an impact on the how hot the earth is and how what season it is. And other effects caused by topography, like if you're on a mountain, or if you are if there is no trees, so there's no shade and things like that, if there's water nearby, those kinds of things. So the Earth receives direct sunlight at the equator, but indirect sunlight at the poles. So even when the Earth is tilted, this area gets direct sunlight pretty much all the time. So that is why the equator is usually rainforest or desert, and typically mostly rainforest. And it's going to get it's going to be warm all year long, and they don't usually have cold periods, and if they do have cold periods, they don't last very long. Between the latitudes of approximately 26.5 north and south of the equator is considered the tropics. Tropics are warmer than the areas above and below that. The tilt of the Earth causes one pole to be closer than the other to the sun, accounts for the seasons that occur everywhere except the equator. Warm air at the equator rises and moves toward the poles where it cools and sinks. Rising air creates zones of air pressure, and then the axis kind of allows for the sun to heat the air and cool it differently. At the equator, the warm air is moist and the air rises. So warm air rises, cool air sinks. So think of like a hot air balloon. That's kind of what helps me remember it. The hot air balloon goes up, so the warm air goes up. So rising air moves toward the poles and the cool air sinks. Areas of high pressure, generally as dry air descends and warms. So the deserts of Africa, Australia, and America occur in these zones where the air is warmer and also very dry. As dry air moves across the Earth, the moisture from both land and water get absorbed. At about 60 north and south, warm air rises and cools, producing another low-pressure area with high rainfall. The moisture supports great forests of the temperate zones. So our area in North America is kind of a temperate zone, and we do have forests here, and these forested areas do experience it does have kind of a winter season. It's got all 4 seasons, and so we are in more of a temperate zone here. So the poles are high pressure areas that have low amounts of precipitation. So the rotation of the Earth affects the precipitations and the winds. In the northern hemisphere, these winds bend clockwise, and the winds bend counterclockwise, so go the opposite direction. The curving patterns of the wind, ocean currents, and cyclones is the result of the rotation of the Earth in the eastward direction. At about 30 north and 30 south, the winds blow southeast and northeast. East coast of the continents at these latitudes are wet. So the global winds, the doldrums occur at the equator, and these are regions of kind of calmer winds, and the trade winds move from the doldrums toward the poles between 30 and 60 north and south. Now I know this all sounds confusing, but we'll look at some pictures in a moment that kind of help make this all make sense. The weaker winds, called the polar easterlies, blow from the east to the west. So if you think about the way that the wind blows for us, usually the wind is going to blow from the west to the east. I mean, it sometimes blows different directions, but most of the time the wind for us is going to blow from the west to the east. It very rarely blows the other directions. So we've got the westerlies, which are strong winds that occur between the 30s and the 60s, blow from the west to the east. Pacific Northwest, the massive evergreen forest. The polar easterlies are weaker winds that blow from the east to the west, so we don't really have those as much. We've got the prevailing westerlies, which are the stronger winds. All right, so here are the pictures I was talking about that are going to help explain it. We've got, if the earth was just straight on, this is more of what we would see, but the earth is more tilted, so this is more of what we see. So when the earth is tilted, here's our sun that stays in place. We can see that the equator is always getting sunlight. But sometimes the northern hemisphere is tilted more toward the sun, and sometimes the southern hemisphere is tilted more toward the sun. So depending on what is tilted more toward the sun, this would be summer and this would be winter because this is tilted away. So this is going to have more darkness and this is going to have more sunlight. And now because this one is tilted closer, this is going to have more sunlight and this is going to have more darkness. In fact, the poles would sometimes have, this would have like 6 months of darkness and this would have 6 months of daylight because of the tilting of the earth. Here are the different moistures and wind circulation patterns. You can see we have the westerlies and the wind is going to blow to the west for us. So most of the time the wind is always going to, blow that direction. But if you just go a little bit south, you're going to get these northeast trade winds. And then you see again, they're going to start blowing the other direction, then again that direction. And that's because there's kind of this cycle of blowing wind here, and that has to do with the ascending moisture air and the loss of cool air. So these patterns are creating these trade winds, and so we get the westerlies, and that's how we get our wind pattern. So these pictures, I think, do a better job of explaining it than all of those words on the previous slides. Now, topography plays a huge role in predicting weather patterns and wind patterns and things like that. Like I said before, I used to live in Kansas, and it was flat, and there were no trees. And so we had amazing wind gusts because there was nothing to stop it. There were no hills or no trees to block the wind, so the wind just blew, and it would blow up dust, and it was so dusty, and there was just nothing to stop the wind. And so the topography was really flat. Topography refers to the physical features of the land, which in Kansas was flat. And it's so different here. There's so many trees, and there's so many hills, and there's so much water, so all of that is topography. And consider like a coastal mountain range. Coastal side is the windward side of the mountain. It receives more rainfall than the leeward side. And that's because as the wind is being pushed against the side of the mountain, it's kind of squeezing all the rain out, kind of like a sponge. And so there isn't as much rain for the leeward side. And this creates what's called a rain shadow. So all of the rain gets squeezed out on the rainward side, and the other side, the leeward side, doesn't get any rain. And so you can see here the moisture coming off of the ocean is squeezed out on this side like a sponge being squeezed out, it causes a rain shadow and the air is dry over here. This is what happened to me where I lived in Kansas because I lived close to the Colorado border and we had the Rockies. And so the Rockies were squeezing all the moisture out on this side. And so by the time over here, I was in a rain shadow. And so we would get very little rain. And we would get some storms, but it was very little. So we lived in a rain shadow of the Rockies, and it was a very dry area over here. So the rain shadow was very, very big, and by the time we got to eastern Kansas, it was much wetter because the clouds had more time to gain precipitation. But the Rockies had created a rain shadow where I lived, and we had a lot of dry air coming down off of those Rockies. So ocean and climate. Ocean temperature is more stable than that of land masses because water actually holds temperature better. Ocean water gains or loses heat more slowly because water in general gains or loses heat more slowly. This causes coasts to have a unique weather pattern that is not observed in land. Any place that lives next to water typically does, especially coasts, because the water is such a huge such a huge body of water. Land water warms more quickly than ocean during the day. The air above the land rises, bringing a cool breeze in from the ocean. At night, this reverses, and a breeze blows from the land toward the sea. India and some other countries in southern Asia have a monsoon climate, which leads to lots of rain. Ocean wind blows onshore for almost half the year. Land heats more rapidly than the water, which causes an enormous circulation of air. The warm air rises over land and is replaced by cooler ocean air, and as the air rises, it loses moisture and the monsoon season begins. This is similar to the lake effect in the United States. So the Great Lakes, and I did live in Akron, Ohio for 2 years, and we would get lake effect snow. So the lake effect snow, you would get these winter snows that would pull in off of the lakes, and it would be winter Arctic winds blow over the Great Lakes and become warm and moisture laden, and it would cause a lot of snowfall over those lakes, and we would get this lake effect snow, which is similar to that monsoon climate, and it would cause a lot of snow to fall over the Akron and Ohio area. All right, so moving on to biome. A biome is a major terrestrial ecosystem characterized by climate and geography. So a biome is looking at climate and geography. A lot of times we would get the question, what is the difference between a biome and an ecosystem? Well, the main difference between a biome and an ecosystem is biome is looking at climate. Ecosystem is just looking at like the animals and the plants in the area. But biome takes into account climate too, and that's one of the main differences. So with a biome, we're looking at climate as well. So a biome has a particular mix of plants and animals adapted to living within a certain environmental conditions. Distribution of biomes around the globe is very patterned, determined principally by differences in climate. Latitude and altitude also play a role, like if it's high up or if it's low down, because if it's higher, it's going to be cooler, typically with lower temperatures and less air pressure. Moving from the equator to the North Pole and so on, it's going to play a role in the type of forest and the type of landscape you run into. Similar sequences is seen when ascending a mountain. Types of trees and type of vegetation you run into, whether it's coniferous forest and alpine tundra, will also play a role. So this is a really great chart that shows annual temperature and annual precipitation. So if you have a colder temperature, I was trying to read it. So this is warm down here, and this is cold up here. And this is lots of rain, and this is little rain. So cold with little rain is a tundra, and warm with little rain is a desert. Warm with lots of rain is a rainforest. So this is a really nice chart that was throwing me off a little bit because I would think this would be switched, that this would be cold and this would be warm up here. But a really good chart that kind of summarizes nicely the different parts. So we are in a more temperate deciduous area, and also we would be in a more like a grassland, not necessarily a savanna. We'd be more in a grassland area. I was seeing if they had a grassland on here, which they really don't. Oh, there we go. So we'd be in this area, kind of in here for Missouri. So another really good chart, just kind of showing the different areas, and you can see that we are the purpley temperate grassland, as I was saying, and temperate deciduous forest, also as I was saying. Temperate is meaning that we experience all the seasons, winter, spring, fall, summer. So we have all the seasons in there, and we are able to have a wide variety. So we have trees and plants that can handle that wide variety. But you can see here along the equator that there is more tropical, with the hot deserts kind of surrounding those tropical areas. And so here's some more hot desert areas. So again, this one's just kind of more of a visual. So we've got the colder, and this is more of like mountain tops, and this is more of like tundra, and then we've got our tropical in the center. So kind of a neat little picture that was drawn. That's kind of a neat way to make the graph. All right, so looking at each type of biome individually, a tundra or an Arctic tundra, these are interesting because they have that layer of permafrost. Permafrost is ground that never unfreezes. It's a permanent frozen layer of ground. So it's like dirt that is always frozen. And this is important because plants cannot penetrate that frozen dirt. Animals cannot dig down through that frozen dirt. It never thaws. And so this makes it important that to understand that only certain animals can live here because you only have a certain amount of usable soil. Yeah. So it covers about 20% of the Earth's land surface, and it's usually toward the upper part of the Earth and the lower part of the Earth. Excuse me. It's cold and dark much of the year, long cold winters and short summers, and not much rainfall. I mean, it does get a little, and only topmost nutrient poor layer of the soil thaws. And trees are not found here because, again, the roots cannot penetrate that far into the soil. The growing season is short and the roots can't go that far, and few animals live in the tundra year round. So they may pass through. Oftentimes it'll be things like polar bears and the moose and hares and things like that. But because the soil is so poor, you're not going to find a lot of things. So caribou, another good example of animals that live here. Short grasses, not very many tall plants because the soil can't sustain that much. Lots of snow, lots of cold, water will sit on top of it, but if you dig down, you're going to find ice. And the upper layers around the Arctic Circle is where you're going to find that. Coniferous forest, think of conifers or trees with cones. So these are trees that do well in cold conditions. They do not need to shed their leaves because their leaves are pine needles. And they are pine cones or cedar trees and dominated by cone-bearing trees, found in 3 primary locations, which is the taiga, which extends around the world in the northern part of North America and Eurasia, near mountain tops, where it is called a montane coniferous forest along the Pacific coast of North America as far south as Northern California. They have long, cold, snowy winters with warm, humid summers. So their winters are typically longer, but they do have summers. Their summers just usually aren't as long. And they have pine, spruce, firs, trees, and cover about 11%. Trees are well adapted to the cold, so that's why, like, the Christmas tree is a pine tree or a fir tree. Leaves and bark have thick coverings to help them adapt to that cold. Needle-like so they can withstand heavy snowfall. The big deciduous trees, deciduous is like the flowering trees with the big pretty leaves that change color in the fall. Those are too delicate for snow, and they would hold the snow and the branches would break. So they don't do well in snow. Forest is covered by moss and lichens, and deer, birds, moose, bears, muskrats, wolves, these are common in this area. Wolverines and mountain lions are common as well. There's really no comparable biomes in southern hemisphere because no large land masses exist really in that area. So it's beautiful. Here's our coniferous trees. Here's our large mountains. Lots of North America and lots of Asia and Europe. Moose, again, are another example. And you do get the bigger trees because the soil does melt enough that they can have deeper roots that penetrate down further. They are pretty rocky, though, and they do get some of these shrubbery kind of bushy grasses as well. Then you have your temperate rainforest. We do have some temperate rainforests in North America, specifically in the United States. We have some in Florida and also kind of in the Washington areas. And so the evergreen forest runs along the west coast of Canada and United States. Plentiful rainfall and rich soil, so they get a lot of rain. Contains some of the tallest conifers in the existence, coastal redwoods, the redwood forests, and common inhabitants, squirrels, lynx, amphibians, reptiles, birds. Some trees can be up to 800 years old in these areas. And spotted owl is an endangered species found in these ecosystems. So temperate rainforests are old growth. They've been around for a very long time. They're not very big, the ones we have in North America at least, and they are found usually along the coast with lots and lots of rain. Not as diverse as the tropical rainforest, but still considered a rainforest. The temperate deciduous forests, these are the ones that most people are more familiar with and more common. They're found in eastern North America and eastern Asia and much of Europe. Moderate climate with relatively high rainfall. Seasons are well defined, 140 to 300 days. These are the ones with the oak, the beech, sycamore, maple, have broad leaves. These are called the deciduous trees because they are flowering trees. They lose their leaf in the fall and regrow them in the spring. This is the one that you'll find in your backyard that you're more common with. These are your deciduous trees. The tallest trees form a canopy. Shorter trees form the understory. Forest floors home to mosses, lichens, and ferns. Chipmunks, turkeys, pheasants, grouse. Again, this is what you guys are familiar with. Grouse and turkeys and squirrels and deer, lots of deer, muskrats and turtles and beavers. There's lakes and streams, beautiful colors in the fall, form layers of humus which turn into fertile soil. So here is the temperate deciduous forest, again what we're familiar with. And this is what they look like. This is a bobcat, very common in this area. Lots of beautiful colors in the fall with the leaves that fall. Tropical rainforest. This is the one you see a lot of pictures of. This is found in the equatorial regions characterized by warm weather and plentiful rainfall, 190 centimeters per year, lots and lots and lots and lots of rain, lots of sunlight, 12 hours of sunlight per day. Most animals and plants found here than anywhere else on Earth. Richest land biomass contains approximately 50% of the Earth's biodiversity. Lots of different kinds of things. Complex structure. They have the understory and the canopy and the emergent layer. So kind of like a high-rise building with different layers where animals live in different places. Lots of insects, epiphytes, which are plants that grow on the trees, so making like little mini ecosystems within the ecosystems. Their roots grow on the other, like the larger trees, so there are other plants that grow on the plants, bromeliads, orchids, and ferns. Again, with the tropical rainforest, the soil is very poor. Due to the rapid recycling of nutrients, the leaves fall, but the animals eat them very quickly, and not a lot of nutrients are left behind. Also, the soil gets like leached out with so much rain, and so the nutrients get leached out of the soil. And so the slash and burn idea is that let's cut the forest down and rapidly grow some nutrients and some crops, and then we will have a good crop for a couple years, but then the nutrients are gone, and so the crops die, and then let's burn some more really quick and plant something new, and the crops are good for a couple years, but when the trees are cleared, the laterite bakes in the hot sunlight to a brick-like consistency and doesn't support the crops, and then they have to do it again. So approximately 2.4 acres of rainforest destroyed per second, 78 million acres annually. It's really sad. Ecologists estimate 137 species are driven to extinction every day because the rainforest is just so diverse. And so that is a really high estimate, but conservation strategies necessary before damage is irreparable. There's so many things being lost, and the rainforest is just such a huge resource that we can't take back. And it took so long to make the rainforest, and once it's gone, it's gone. So we need to do what we can to protect it while it's still here and before it's too late. So we've got the forest floor and the understory, and then we've got the canopy, and different things live in different levels. And so the ferns live on the forest floor. We've got the epiphytes that live in the understory, and then we've got the canopy, which is the tallest trees, which are getting the sunlight and kind of making a block for light to not be able to penetrate down to the lower layers. So here's an epiphyte growing on a broad-leafed evergreen, so it has grown on the plant. You can see where the rainforests are, mostly in South America, Africa, and then a lot of the islands over here, and then a jaguar, and they are found mostly in South America. Shrublands, regions that tend to have dry summers and wet winters. Shrubs are woody but shorter than trees and lack a large central trunk, so they often have many parts coming out of the bottom, not one central long trunk like a tree. Small, thick evergreen leaves coated with a waxy material. The waxiness helps to protect them from losing water. Dense shrubland in California, known as chaparral, and lacks an understory and ground litter. Highly flammable, and seeds of many species require the heat to activate and increase their germination. So fires are normal. Fires are actually good. Fires are expected. The seeds won't open without a fire. So even though we think fires are bad, in nature, fires are normal and started by lightning strikes. So yes, it's bad for us, but fires are a natural part of nature, and some plants require the fire in order for the nutrients to be released and the plants to grow. Common animals include mule deer, rodents, lizards, and the greater roadrunner. So here's the shrublands. It's just a kind of a small part here and a little bit over here and some down here. But you can see the roadrunner. It's a cute roadrunner. We had a couple roadrunners at the zoo I worked at. They were pretty neat. Grasslands, something else you're probably familiar with, especially if you've ever traveled through Kansas to the mountains. Most people tease and say that you have to get through Kansas just to get to the mountains. But they are one of the best places to grow crops. They have a little rain, but not generally enough to support trees. But the grasses are well adapted to changing environments. They tolerate a high degree of grazing, flooding, drought, and fire. And they are good at growing a lot of different seeds. Temperate grasslands have very cold winters and hot and dry summers, so there's a wide range of variation. So like hot summers and then cold winters, so they have to tolerate a lot. Very, very fertile. All those grasses and all those plants have made very fertile soil. It's probably the best for growing crops, which is why farmers utilize them so often for crops, because it is really the best. Savannas have a cool, dry season and a hot, rainy season, so they're a little bit different than the temperate grasslands. Savannas are just a little different, and because they have the seasons a little more defined than the temperate grasslands, and characterized by large expanses of grasses with relatively few trees. So here's the temperate grasslands. Again, Kansas, great example. And then they go over into Asia a bit. Bison, wonderful example, the Kansas state mammal. Beautiful, beautiful flat plains. Sometimes I miss Kansas. Savannas. With savannas, they do have the ability to grow some more trees and some more dry seasons with these kind of watering holes that the animals travel to. And with the savannas, you're going to see more in Africa and South America, and they are going to contain more migratory animals. So with the savannas, you get these animals that follow kind of the rainy seasons, and that's more in the southern hemisphere. All right, deserts. What can I say? Dry. Now, a desert just means dry. It doesn't necessarily mean hot and dry. It just means it lacks moisture. Typically, we associate that with hot and dry, but deserts can be cold too. In fact, the driest desert in the world is actually a cold desert on mountain. Nights usually are cold in general, because when the sun goes down, there is nothing to protect. There's usually not going to be any trees or anything like that. Surface is usually covered with, if there are plants, like scrubby plants or scraggly plants, and maybe a cactus plant or two. Adaptations include, for the plants, thick epidermal layers with the cuticles, waxy coatings to try and preserve that water, needle leaves, spines to protect them so that animals won't eat them. Reptiles and insects are more common because they can keep the water in and they don't have to worry about overheating because they are ectothermic and make their own body temperatures. Lizards and snakes, burrowing rodents, and birds will burrow down. Mammals and hawks and foxes will live underground during the day and then come out at night. 30% of Earth's surface, so it is a larger portion of the Earth, is these deserts, and you can see we have deserts in North America, a good portion of Africa, and Australia as well. And so here is a kit fox, which is an example of an animal that lives in a desert. And some of the deserts, the plants of the desert, scraggly bushes, not many trees are going to be able to grow very well, and the ones that do usually have some form of protection to hold water. All right, aquatic ecosystems. Two broad categories. We've got freshwater and saltwater. The water cycle, saltwater evaporates, leaving the salts behind, and some rainwater sinks or percolates into the ground and saturates. Layers of water in the ground is the groundwater table. And gravity returns all fresh water to the sea. So the streams will empty into rivers, and the rivers will eventually empty out into the sea. So a lot of these streams will get their water from the rain or from springs or from melt from mountains and things like that, and it'll all be returned to the rivers, and the rivers return it to the sea. So along this route to the sea, it passes through streams and rivers and can be contained in lakes and ponds over time. So again, mountains, streams, lakes, returning it all to the sea, which eventually returns it to the ocean. Mountain streams and rivers form when frozen precipitation at higher elevation melts. Found in higher elevations, cold, low in nutrients and biodiversity. Mayflies and trouts are common species. Water warms and increases in nutrients as it travels to the lower elevations. Bodies of fresh water classified by nutrient status. Oligotrophic is a small amount of organic matter, and eutrophic is plentiful organic matter and high in productivity. Eutrophication is the process in which a body of water receives a large input of nutrients in a relatively short amount of time, typically in the form of fertilizer from a field if a farmer is putting fertilization on his crops. Here's some different types of lakes. This one is obviously clean and clear. This one is not so much. This one is a eutrophic lake and has a lot of algae. Algae is typically present when a lot of fertilizer is present. And this one has probably been around, like a bunch of farmers have put fertilizer on their crops, and that has filtered into this pond from nearby. So in temperate zones, deep lakes are stratified in the summer and winter and have distinct vertical zones. A Pilliminion is the surface layer. It's warm from the sun, contains phytoplankton. Thermocline, which is the middle layer, it's cooler, and the hypilominium layer, which is the bottom layer, which is very cold. And the detritus accumulates on the bottom layer, and decomposition, whenever anything decomposes, it's going to release it's going to take up oxygen and release nutrients, and this isn't something you want to happen because it's going to take up the oxygen from the plants and make a situation where the animals that live there do not have enough oxygen. So you want to make sure that the animals that are in the pond or the lake have enough oxygen. So as the season progresses, the epipillimin layer becomes nutrient poor, while the hypo layer begins to be depleted of oxygen. So fall overturn, the epilum water becomes cooler than the water in the hypo one, and this causes the surface water to sink and deep water to rise, and this causes kind of an overturn, and the process continues until the temperature is uniform. In springtime, there's an overturn as the ice melts, and the temperature will eventually become uniform throughout. Vertical stratification. Sorry, I'm paying attention to the time, and I'm trying to speed us up. So we've got our summer stratification. In fall, the wind kind of turns it. Winter, it stratifies because the wind and the ice make it kind of more stratified, and then summer, it kind of overturns. So in winter and fall, it mixes, and then in summer and winter, it stratifies. There are different levels of life, phytoplankton and zooplankton. Phytoplankton is, think of it as plants, and zooplankton is tiny animals. And then we have different levels, the loiteral, limnetic, profundal, and benthic. So loiteral is closest to the shore. Limnetic is the sunlit, and then profundal is below the light, and benthic is the bottom. So here you can see the different zones, the profundal at the very bottom. or sorry, benthic is at the very bottom, profundal is right above that, and littoral is at the closest to the surface. We have wetlands, marshes, swamps, and bogs. Marshes is wetlands frequently or continually inundated by water, so water is constantly coming in. Swamps are wetlands dominated by either woody plants or shrubs, so we have a lot of plants here. American alligators found in swamps. And bogs are wetlands characterized by acidic waters, peat depositions, and sphagnum mosses. So this is more of a mossy area, and swamps are more of a woody plant area, and marshes have more water coming in. There's a lot of benefits to having a wetland, so it's like a good stopping point for migrating birds. It is good for refilling the underwater. It is good for breaking down toxic waste and excessive nutrients. And it is good for elimination of food and habitats for many species too. Estuaries occur where fresh water and seawater mix, so it's a mixture of the two. And estuaries are nutrient rich because the sea prevents the rapid escape of nutrients brought by the river. They're biologically diverse and highly productive. Nearly 2/3 of all marine fish and shellfish require development in the estuary, so it's kind of like the nursery of the sea. They have to come here first because they are such a richly developed area. There's an intertidal zone. This lies between the high and the low tide mark. Brown algae is characteristic of this mid portion, and seaweed are located below the intertidal zone. So here's a mud flat, a mango swamp, and a rocky shore. Coral reefs are like the rainforest of the ocean. Corals are a symbiotic relationship between algae and corals, which are a type of jellyfish. They're related to jellyfish and anemones. And they provide an abundance of habitat. They are bleaching due to global warming, but coral reefs provide a huge diversity of life, and they are vital to the diversity of the ocean. Now, the ocean itself is an epipelagic, a mesopelagic, and a bathypelagic. Epipelagic lacks inorganic nutrients. Mesopelagic is the deeper waters that contains many carnivores and no light here. And bathypelagic is the deepest, and there are complete darkness, and except for those that bioluminesce, and then there are carnivores and scavengers here. The deepest areas of the ocean are called the abyssal zones, and they do have some organisms that are dependent on the debris that sinks down, and there are some ocean ridges here. There are hydrothermal vents, and they can get up to 350 degrees Celsius. This is really hot. Keep in mind it's Celsius. This is where the chemosynthesis will take place with some of those bacteria. And although energy is lost with a transfer to each trophic level, pollutants can become concentrated as they move up the web and affect term biomagnification. And this was that issue that we saw with DDT and the bald eagles. So this shows different ocean inhabitants at different levels, and some animals will only live in the very deep levels, and some animals will travel back and forth. Giant squids we have not seen at the deeper levels yet. We haven't seen at the surface levels. We've only seen them at the deeper levels. And some animals will go back and forth between the different levels. We have sent cameras down to the bottom, and we've seen some of these at bottom levels before. And some of them we've only seen at the top levels. With still much of the bottom levels we have not explored. So with ocean currents, their major ocean currents move warm water and heat from the equator to cooler parts. So these currents carry the water and heat different parts of the coastlines. The Gulf Stream current moves east coast of North America in higher latitudes. Another current in southern hemisphere warms the eastern current coast of South America, the Humboldt Current, and the southern hemisphere flows towards the equator. An upwelling cold offshore wind replaces the warm nutrients, so called an El Nino in southern oscillation. So here you can see the currents. We've got the blue representing the cold and the red representing the warm, and you can see how they travel. And so these warm currents will sometimes mix with the cold, but they can cause, so this would be like a colder area here, and this is a warmer one. And they travel in these very predictable patterns. There was a boat that had a bunch of rubber duckies that tipped over, and they are still finding the rubber duckies, so they are able to unintentionally track the currents based on where those rubber duckies are ending up and watching where those rubber duckies have traveled, because they know where they were all accidentally dumped, and so they were able to track them and track the currents by default. All right, that's it. We are finished with chapters for biology, and so I hope you guys have learned a lot this semester. If you have any questions, by all means, please let me know. You guys have done a great job. And yeah, if you have anything you need to know, by all means, please reach out. Thank you guys. Bye.